Hello, and welcome to this evening's edition of Scotland at 7. My name is Ruth Watson. Joining me this evening is Linda Fabiani, retired MSP for East Kilbride and former Deputy Presiding Officer at the Scottish Parliament. Good evening, Linda. Thanks for joining us. So before I go to Linda for her thoughts and observations on the news of today, I'll have a quick run through of the headlines. The Ukraine update, day 323. Russian mercenaries, the Wagner Group, claimed its forces found the body of one of two voluntary aid workers from the UK reported missing in eastern Ukraine. It did not give the name of the dead man, but said documents belonging to both UK citizens had been found on his body. A photo posted alongside the statement appeared to show passports bearing the names of Andrew Bagshaw and Christopher Parry, the two missing workers. The SNP's Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn MP, has demanded root and branch reform of MPs' outside earnings and dark money donations, following the scandal exposed by the Sky News Westminster Accounts investigation. Stephen Flynn MP said that egregious examples of Tory and Labour Party MPs earning millions in outside earnings from second jobs and receiving further millions in murky donations from non-transparent and questionable sources showed the Westminster system is broken and corrupt. A new report has revealed the UK government's state pension is failing to support even the minimum standard of living in the UK. The Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association Annual Retirement Living Standard Report, published today, shows the income required to maintain a basic standard of living has massively outstripped the rise in the state pension. Support for leaving the EU has dropped significantly and sometimes dramatically in member states across the bloc in the wake of the UK's Brexit referendum, according to data from a major pan-European survey. The European Social Survey, led by City University of London and conducted in 30 European nations every 2 years since 2001, found respondents were less likely to vote leave in every EU member state for which data is available. At Holyrood today, SNP MSP Gordon MacDonald asked what economic levers the Scottish Government requires to escape the bleak forecasts compiled by Consensus Economics, showing the UK facing the worst and longest recession in the G7. London Mayor Sadiq Khan is expected to criticise the denial and avoidance of Brexit's immense damage in a speech which will be at odds with Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer and his support for Brexit. The London Mayor's comments are being interpreted as a thinly veiled swipe at the Labour leader's recent enthusiastic backing of Brexit. Social Justice Secretary Shona Robeson has announced an additional £2.4 million in funding to help people struggling to afford food and other essentials. The funds will go to 4 organisations to distribute, mainly on a cash-first basis, to people in immediate need in the face of the cost of living crisis. More than 80 actions supported by £68 million over the course of this Parliament are outlined in the Scottish Government's response to Changing Lives, the final report from the Drugs Deaths Task Force. Measures are being taken across a broad range of areas, including employment, justice, transport, education, health and social care, to improve the lives of those affected by drugs. The UK government could soon be placed on the list of countries that abuse rather than protect human rights with its outright assault on the rights of its own citizens and aggressive rollback of protections such as the right to assemble and protest, according to the international NGO Human Rights Watch. Nearly 100 British Council contractors forced to live in hiding since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan have been given the green light to come to the UK. After 18 months of moving between safe houses while they were hunted by soldiers of the new regime, about half of the contractors who worked for the council have had their final security checks signed off. Well, coming back to the stories of the day for a bit of a chat and an analysis with Linda Fabiani, we go back to Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces are holding on as fierce fighting continues in Soledar, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said today, adding that the number of Russian military units had risen from 280 to 280 from 250 a week earlier. A Russian-installed official in Ukraine's Donetsk region, Andrei Baevsky, said pockets of resistance from Ukrainian troops remain in Soledar, undermining claims made on Wednesday by the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, that Soledar had fallen. The latest intelligence update from the UK Ministry of Defence said over the last 2 days, heavy fighting has continued around the town of Soledar, Donetsk Oblast, and on the approaches of Crimea, Luhansk Oblast. The Ukrainian military has claimed its forces killed more than 100 Russian soldiers in a single strike in Soledar. Ukrainian forces reportedly launched a missile at Russian troops, the command of Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said in an update early today. President Zelensky has called for his forces to be ready both at the border and in the regions near Belarus, amid fear Russia may launch a fresh assault from the north. The commander of Russia's ground forces, Oleg Salyukov, visited Belarus on Thursday to inspect the combat readiness of a joint force stationed there, the Belarusian Defense Ministry said. Andrei Kartapolov, the head of the State Duma Defense Committee, a former Russian Deputy Minister of Defense, has suggested the country could increase the age of conscription for military service from 27 to 30 for this year's spring draft campaign. Poland plans to send 10 German-made Leopard tanks to Ukraine as part of an international coalition, the Polish president said on a visit to Lviv on Wednesday. The transfer would require permission from Germany. Ukraine has also been pressing the German government to supply Leopard 2 battle tanks. A Ukrainian soldier has had successful surgery to remove an unexploded grenade from his chest. Hanna Maliar, Ukraine's Deputy Minister of Defense, has said surgeons removed the weapons from just beneath the heart of the injured serviceman, while 2 sappers ensured the operation was conducted safely. Well, Linda, the Ukraine war, the Russian war in Ukraine, doesn't really show much sign of letting up, although there are signs of strain. I saw today that 2 of the heads of the sort of Russian military had been deposed, demoted, or set down, relieved of their duties, shall we say, and no doubt heading for defenestration soon, given the current regime's apparent predilection for such things. But what does this tell you about the way in which the Russian approach is coming in, the potential involvement of Belarus, and what's happening within NATO and their sort of their approach to Zelensky and the Ukrainian effort?
Ruth, I wouldn't begin to pretend to know what's going on there. I mean, all folk like us can talk about is impressions we get. And, my overriding impression is that Ukraine under President Zelensky is absolutely determined to win here and will never give in. And when you look at the history of Ukraine and what that nation has suffered over the years and the uncertainty that has come at them all the time, you can understand why that determination exists. And I think I can understand that. I would hope that, had myself and my own country been through such horror over the years, that there would be a resistance there to any more of it. I would hope that we would behave the same. So I can understand that. What I don't understand is the Russian people, because surely they can see that what's happening here is wrong. When you look at, the likes of, I didn't know about these officers that you've just spoken about, Ruth. When you look at how people are deposed like that, and then, as you say, what happens to them very often, mysterious deaths, um, the fear that people are being forced to live under in so many ways. And then you look when they're talking about raising the age for conscription. Surely the Russian people must be looking at this and saying, this isn't right. Our leaders are not behaving as they should behave. They are in the wrong here. How long will the Russian people put up with this and just accept everything that Vladimir Putin is doing? And indeed, how long will those round about him put up with it? Because they know. They're not stupid people. They know exactly what's going on. Fear is keeping them in this team at the moment. There's been a few dissidents and who have disappeared. Um, but surely there must come a point where either ethics come into it or fear that to carry on with this is actually going to have a worse outcome for them personally, if that's all that matters to them. Now, myself, I think Putin is beyond any of that. Call it narcissism, call it psychopathy, whatever. He is beyond any of that. But there must be people round about him who look at it and say, this can't go on forever. Ukraine's not going to give in. How long can Putin sustain the support in Russia, whether by those round about him or ordinary Russian citizens?
It's very interesting, isn't it, to see the potential moves from Belarus, because the
Yeah.
Belarusian colonels were said to be very against, have been said for the last year or so, to be very against any form of actual engagement other than allowing safe passage for Russian troops through Belarus. And as more tanks sort of come and more equipment comes from European nations, um, it, I guess there is that possibility of escalation. Although I do completely agree with the line that Zelensky takes, which is that sort of protecting Ukraine is a form of protecting the European Union, because if Ukraine falls in, you can bet your bottom dollar that Estonia, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania are next. In fact, when you see Putin talking in recent speeches about being an expansionist nation, it really is as though he's sort of hankering back to the days of the USSR, which many of
Yeah.
our viewers won't even remember.
Do you know, that's the interesting thing. No, people don't remember. We forget. I forget how old I am, you know, and things that just seem like fairly recently to me are actually, they're not modern studies anymore. They're history. See, a bit like myself, they're now history. And yeah, so many generations after me and even after you don't remember these things. And how scary it was. The Cold War was really scary. I remember as a child being absolutely convinced that we were all going to be thrown at. So yes, there has to be a guard against it. Belarus, um, there must be stuff going on in the background. All these things that we never hear about going on in the background, whether it's NATO, whether it's what we'll call the allies in Europe talking to Belarus. They've got to decide what is in the interests of their nation. I know they have some dodgy leaders. We know that. So again, the self-interest of these people are going to come into it as well. So it's really, really hard to know which way Belarus will go when push comes to shove, and they're really in a position of having to do something.
Well, looking to more domestic concerns, the SNP's Westminster leader Stephen Flynn MP has demanded root and branch reform of MPs' outside earnings and dark money donations following the brewing scandal exposed by the Sky News Westminster Accounts investigation. Stephen Flynn MP said the egregious examples of Tory and Labour Party MPs earning millions in outside earnings from second jobs and receiving millions in murky donations from non-transparent and questionable sources showed the Westminster system is broken and corrupt. Having raised the issue of Boris Johnson's outside earnings at Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, the SNP Westminster leader has now written to Rishi Sunak, calling for him to introduce robust UK legislation to ban dark money donations, block MPs from taking second jobs that involved a considerable time commitment or conflict of interest, and to ensure tight restrictions and full transparency on outside earnings. Commenting, SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn said, "Being elected as an MP is a privilege and must never be treated as anything less than a full-time job. Yet dozens of Tory, Labour Party and Lib Dem MPs seem to be more interested in raking in cash through second jobs and dark money donations than standing up for their constituents." This is the MP expenses scandal all over again. The Westminster system is broken and corrupt. The scandal shows Scotland would be much better off as an independent country, escaping Westminster control for good. It does raise a number of issues, doesn't it? I mean, it's I have extreme sympathy for those professionals, for example, doctors and nurses who need to keep up, sort of professional skills and
Mhm.
qualifications, and who actually provide a public service and do sort of good to the common weal. So, and even David Lammy, I could understand actually in some ways Keir Starmer's or Sir Keir Starmer's um, quite guarded defence of his radio job at LBC, saying that was an extension of his job
Mm.
as an MP. I can understand that, although I do think that politicians and former politicians should be careful of the programmes that they come on. Um, but what's your view of the whole this whole debacle? Because surely this is just an extension of the cast for questions. And I mean, if dark money wasn't an issue,
Yeah.
then just look at
I mean, I
Sunak.
think I can't remember the exact wording that Stephen Flynn used, but he was quite careful in his wording. I mean, he was not saying ban second jobs or outside earnings altogether. He was very careful in how he put it. I don't have it in front of me. Um, but he's absolutely right. It is corrupt. It's quite clearly corrupt, and it's not just the outside earnings. It's when you look at the type of them. It's MPs being taken on as consultants here and there for so many days a year at thousands and thousands. Now, give that its proper name, it's about lobbying. So there are those MPs who take money from companies, organisations, not because of their expertise, but because of their perceived access to decision makers. So that's corrupt. I mean, when you look at it's not just money coming in terms of earnings, personal stuff. It's also in kind. Um, I mean, take Boris Johnson. He's a case in point. My goodness, I don't think it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think he's actually been working as an MP since he stopped being party leader. He seems to be all over the world, all sorts of places, and doing things, giving speeches, earning fortunes. I also was reading the other day about his loan of accommodation in London from a donor. Uh, so again, that just can't be right. But there's also the dark money donations that Stephen's talking about. That's quite clearly corrupt. And then when you tie that into the other things, like the House of Lords, I mean, I think that's the most corrupt thing that there is in the UK system. Those that get elected to the House of Lords for all sorts of reasons. Um, and when you look back historically, I'm not saying that Westminster has ever been perfect. Of course it hasn't. But again, back to that age thing, it doesn't seem that long ago to me that people were resigning and losing their jobs as MPs for things that now seem to happen on a daily basis and nobody bats an eyelid about. So yes, I do think it's time for a root and branch look at all this. There's still the issue about swapping main residencies in terms of the accommodation people are allowed to buy as well. But Rishi Sunak's not going to do anything about it. He's part of the establishment. I don't actually believe that the main parties in Westminster at all. That means Labour, Lib Dem. Well, Lib Dem are not so main anymore, but the long-standing establishment UK parties, I don't think there's a real interest there for any of them to seriously do anything about it. And I think that's a big problem. So we have to we have to be the ones that do something about it. Scotland has to say, do you know what? It is broken. This is rubbish. We need to walk away from this. We need independence so that we can take the decisions to try to ensure that our own political system is fair and is ethical. And it's not going to happen at Westminster because there isn't the will there to do it from any of them.
So, what do you think should be happening within Holyrood and MSPs who have second jobs or third jobs, or I've lost track of how many jobs Douglas Ross MSP has. But I mean, it does seem to me as though being an MSP or an MP is a pretty full time job. I don't understand how people have the time to do all these other
Do you know,
jobs.
Ruth, it
What's that all
absolutely,
about?
it absolutely stuns me. I mean, I was, 22 years as an MSP. I worked my butt off, you know. I worked really hard. It's not just the 3 days a week or whatever that you spend in Parliament. It's the constituency stuff, which was the most important thing to me. And it was hard work. But I also had a recognition that if someone chose to and felt secure enough in their seat, in their place, that they could coast. I've seen people coasting. So there has to be a recognition that to be an elected member in either parliament is a full-time job, and one should be expected to make it a full-time job. And for most people, I have to say, I believe that for most MSPs in Holyrood, it is a full-time job, and in fact beyond a full-time job. For others, it's perhaps not quite so important. So transparency must be the major thing that has to happen. We all know that, you've used Douglas Ross as an example, the other jobs he has. I would like there to be an audit carried out generally, more than just declaring the interest and everything else, but a declaration of how long you spend on these other jobs. So, and I also don't understand how somebody can be an MP and an MSP at the same time, because, to me, if you're doing it properly, there is no way you could do more than one job. I would like to think I did it properly. And I think, lots of people, most people, in fact, do it properly to the best of their ability because they're there for the right reasons.
What do you think the impact is in terms of the democratic institution if somebody takes elected office and yet doesn't sort of kind of squanders their time or pursues their own interests, feathers their own nest potentially? What does that do to people's engagement in the democratic process, and what can we do to guard against that and to tighten things up so that people are able to maintain, like I'm sure Sandesh Gulhane, you always see MSP, you always see him wearing scrubs. I'm sure he must spend a lot of time working as a doctor. But I actually didn't that he was practicing anywhere, and I'm never quite sure so many different scrubs on, because I thought he was a GP and I didn't think GPs. However,
I've got an issue
I think
about the way he does that. I do. I've got an
I mean,
issue
I think that that's
about
an.
the way.
I actually think that, pardon me. I think that goes against. I was.
That's what I,
I am. I thought that went against the conduct of the professional body that he's a member of. I have to say,
well,
but
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. I don't
how
think
does
to
one?
me it's
How
the
does
full advantage, standing there in these scrubs slagging off the Scottish government. Yeah, there's all sorts of things jar me with that. What are you?
so? I
Are
mean,
you an
given
MSP
given
or
your
are you?
given your former given
Mhm.
your former position as presiding officer or deputy presiding officer, what what could or should be done, you think, to sort of
Mm.
whip whip the MSPs or the code of conduct
Well,
into a better place?
well, currently there is nothing to stop some of that stuff going on. But to me, it should come from the body of the kirk, if you like, the MSPs themselves, the parties. I mean, there are very few independents come into Holyrood. So the parties form the bulk of the MSPs. And I think what should happen is that parties should be together in deciding what is the fairest way to do this. Now, there was some work done in the lobbying bill, for example, which makes it much harder for lobbyists, ergo makes for payments and things like that. But I think it's about transparency, not just noting that occasionally you work as a doctor or occasionally you work as a journalist or whatever, but to actually note your earnings from it, of course, and the amount of time you spend on it. Because if it's very open and very transparent, um, not only will people out there in the electorate see what's going on, but there must be colleagues of some of these folk that get really, I nearly said a word I shouldn't on screen, but get really fed up with seeing colleagues who are not really pulling their weight in the greater body of the group. And that's quite galling, and it can be very, very powerful. So it has to come from the parties and the people within the parties that are elected.
Well, food for thought indeed.
Yeah.
Now, moving on to UK pensions, a new report has revealed that the UK government's state pension is failing to support even the minimum standard of living in the UK. The Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association Annual Retirement Living Standard report published today shows the income required to maintain a basic standard of living has massively outstripped the rise in the state pension. To date, the minimum income now sits at £12,800, while the state pension will rise to £10,600 for those on the full flat rate. However, as a consequence of Rishi Sunak's decision as Chancellor to suspend the pensions triple lock for 1 year, the state pension now stands at £520 a year less than it would have been. The SNP's social justice spokesperson, David Linden MP, has warned a failure to fix a shortfall in the state pension will have devastating consequences for millions of pensioners across the UK. Commenting, David Linden MP said, in 2014, people in Scotland were warned that their pensions would be at risk if Scotland didn't remain part of the UK. Today, their state pension doesn't even support the minimum standard of living. This is a direct consequence of continued Westminster control and 12 years of austerity-driven Tory policies. And this is a pretty moot point, isn't it, Linda? It's a cost of living crisis. I was reading a report the other day which was giving actually quite alarming figures, I mean, heartbreaking figures of the amount of people being admitted to hospital with hypothermia in Scotland. It's it actually haunts me to think that I'm sitting in my beautiful warm house and literally 300 yards from where I live, there's a street where I know there are people sitting in their coats, freezing cold. You know, an elderly couple I know, both of whom are being treated for cancer, and they can't heat their home. And it's such a horrific state of affairs. It's hard to know how much more people will take, but what can the pensioners do? What can people do? I mean, it just feels like there's constant sticking plasters being put on these
Hmm.
to mitigate
Yeah.
these awful effects.
Well,
So what
there
can
was discussion.
what can the politicians do, and what can we do?
Oh, now there's a big question. For those who are totally reliant on the state pension, those pensioners, uh, well, it's more than that. It covers a whole spectrum, Ruth. There are the lucky pensioners. I'm a lucky pensioner, right? Got a state pension, but I also have a fairly decent private pension. Um, I'm very fortunate. You have those who have nothing other than their state pension, which, as David Linden pointed out today, because of the year of the triple lock being dumped, and because of just generally how pensions in the UK have gone, is below what should be the minimum income. And add to that the fact that the top-up system through the welfare state has been eroded by the Tories over the last 12, nearly 13 years. So that has made it worse too. But you also have an issue with those people who just have a small private pension that just takes them over that threshold that says they're entitled to no other help. So these are the people, that whole swathe of senior citizens who are unable to heat their home, who are having to decide between food. And then you also have, there was a big campaign for the women who were done out of some of their full state pension because, the age changed, but there was women, uh, caught because of the age they happened to be when the law changed in relation to state pension. So there's an awful lot of people there that are having a really hard time. We say, what can we do about it? Well, you're only back to charity, and I have a real issue with basic human rights in a country, the basic necessities of shelter and warmth and food being dependent on charity. And it's a way that this country has been going for some years now. It's absolutely disgusting. Governments can do stuff about it. They choose not to. The Tory government chooses not to do anything about it because it relies on the third sector and it relies on individuals giving charity as well. So something could be done. They choose not to do it. Meanwhile, people try and plug the gaps, but there's always people that fall through it. Folk who don't have family that are comfortable, folk who are very isolated. And these are the people that are at the real danger. These are the people that are ending up in hospital with hypothermia. And also folk who are just scared to turn on their heating. I've come across people who perhaps could afford to keep themselves warm, perhaps, but who are absolutely terrified because they have been raised in a philosophy that says you don't allow yourself to get into debt. You got to pay your own way. Therefore, um, they're harming themselves because they are scared that they're going to end up on Poor Street, and they have no confidence in the UK government. Scottish government does what it can, but was the Scottish government set up to mitigate the worst excesses of the Westminster government and try and keep our own citizens getting by day to day, whether it's the child payment, whether it was the mitigation of the bedroom tax and all these other things? There's only so far that their money will go to try and mitigate some of this. And I'm not seeing an answer because I think it's getting worse. Because those in power are too busy looking after themselves, in my opinion, and looking after those that keep them there. And actually, they see everyone else as pretty much expendable. I think that's been proven over and over again. So, what do we do about it? We take our own decisions. To me, that's the only
So
thing to do about it.
do you get the feeling? I mean, given your demographic, and I shall be gentle with your age disclosure, but
Thank you.
given your demographic, the circle of people that you're moving in and folk that you're talking to sort of out with the political bubble, when you're talking to just folk in the community, do you get any sense that there is a shift happening in terms of people's understanding and awareness of where the problem lies and what is being done to them, or is there still work to be done, to get messaging across as to the reason why so many people are suffering?
It's a difficult one. When folk are just going day to day, trying to keep warm and trying to feed themselves, there's not an awful lot of time for philosophising. Uh, I'm the chair of an organisation in East Kilbride called Healthy and Active, and I'm now part of a network of local organisations, and I have to say the local council as well, setting up warm banks. Um, we've had food banks for far too long now. We're now setting up warm banks where people can actually have somewhere to go during the day that they can be warm. Do people realise the cause of it? I think that there's two things here. I think people have got much more of an awareness of the fact that we have a UK government that doesn't actually give a toss and that has absolutely caused an awful lot of the current situation. I think people have an awareness of that. But I also think they're so ground down that they're not seeing that an alternative is possible. So I think the big issue is to let people see that an alternative is possible. And one of the things that, the likes of the Tories rely on is that people are ground down. It suits them when people lose interest in the democratic process. It suits them when people don't go out to vote because that helps to keep them in power. So it's a big job we've got here. And so while there's an awareness that who's to blame, there's not a great deal of hope out there in an awful lot of cases, and I think that's the problem.
Well, given political engagement across Europe has raised in the face of Brexit, apparently, support for leaving the EU has dropped significantly and sometimes dramatically in member states across the bloc in the wake of the UK's Brexit referendum, according to data from a major pan-European survey. The European Social Survey, ESS, led by City, University of London, and conducted in 30 European nations every 2 years since 2001, found respondents were less likely to vote leave in every EU member state for which data was available. The largest decline in leave support was Finland, where 28.6% of respondents who declared which way they would vote in a Brexit-style referendum answered leave in 2016 to 17, 15.4% did in 2020-22, a fall of 13.2 percentage points. Similarly, start between 2016 and 2022 were recorded in the Netherlands with a drop of 9.5 percentage points, Portugal 9.1, Austria 8.5, and France 8.3, with a smaller but still statistically significant fall in Hungary of 5.8%, Spain and Sweden of 4.6%, and Germany of 2.6%. Support for leave in the survey's most recent round was highest in the Czech Republic, with 29.2%, Italy 20.1%, and Sweden 19.3%. But even in those countries, it had declined by 4.5 percentage points, 9.1 percentage point, and 4.6 percentage points respectively since 2016-17, the survey showed. Leave was the least popular in Spain, with only 4.7%. The period covers the UK's long and fraught negotiations to leave the EU, but also the ensuing political turmoil, 5 prime ministers in 6 years, and the current social and economic woes, all of which have been heavily reported on the continent and are widely interpreted as being caused, at least partly, by Brexit. And continuing in that vein, at Holyrood today, SNP MSP Gordon MacDonald asked what economic levers the Scottish Government requires to escape the bleak forecasts compiled by the Census Economics, showing the UK facing the worst and longest recession in the G7. In a question to the Scottish Government, Mr MacDonald highlighted the recent forecasts and the damning statistic showing more than 3/4 of members of the British Chambers of Commerce say the UK Tory Brexit deal is not helping them increase sales or grow their business. In response, Deputy First Minister John Swinney said there is clear evidence that Brexit is damaging Scotland's economic prosperity, and an independent Scotland would benefit from having power over areas such as free trade, employment laws, and migration policy. Commenting, SNP MSP Gordon MacDonald said, "People and businesses across Scotland are suffering because of inept and out-of-touch prime ministers, governments, and policies we don't vote for. The sooner Scotland becomes a normal, independent country, the better, so we can escape a disastrous future under Westminster control." And then just to consolidate that, even from within Labour, Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, is expected to criticise the denial and avoidance of Brexit's immense damage in a speech which will be at odds with Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer's support for Brexit. The London mayor's comments are being interpreted as a thinly veiled swipe at the Labour leader's recent enthusiastic backing of Brexit. SNP MSP Rona Mackay said, "Coming from a party heavyweight, Sadiq Khan's public recognition that Brexit is an unmitigated catastrophe is a damning indictment of Starmer's ludicrous backing of Brexit. It does two things. It exposes divisions within the party over Labour's current stance on Brexit, and it highlights the brazen dishonesty at the heart of Sir Keir Starmer's position." The Labour leader continues to peddle the lie that there is no case for the UK to even join the European single market, despite the long-term damage being out of the euro, the single inflicting on our economy, and despite polls demonstrating an ever-increasing of the people of Britain who believe Brexit was a massive mistake. Ms Mackay added, it also shows contempt for Scotland's Remain vote, and that he thinks he can ignore Scotland like the Tories do. Labour have abandoned Scotland and support the Tories' hard Brexit. The SNP only way to fix the damage of Brexit is to rejoin the EU, but regardless of who forms the next government at Westminster, neither Labour nor the Tories are offering Scotland that option. It's quite stark, isn't it? I mean, I've been reporting on and following with close and ever increasingly alarming alarmed fears over what's happening with Brexit, in particular coming up at the end of 2023, the sunsetting with the EU revocation and repeal of bill that Rees-Mogg put in
Mm-hmm.
before he was still in Parliament. What do you think is the way ahead for Scotland, the impact of Brexit on the Scottish economy and Scotland's people and freedom of movement and our opportunities? And what did you make of Alistair Jack, MP and Secretary of State for Scotland, comments about? I mean, it was just it's it
Most
was such a
bizarre.
rank lie. I mean, I don't understand how people are allowed to get away now. I mean, Lindsay
Mm-hmm.
Hoyle as Speaker, I don't understand how blatant mistruths or distorting of facts are allowed now in the House. I mean, I take it as a former deputy presiding officer, you will have your own views on the role of the
Yeah,
Speaker. It's very odd.
it is very odd. But they do
There's
just
so
lie.
much.
They just lie. They do it all the time. They rewrite history. Alistair Jack just rewrites history all the time. And to say something like people in Scotland don't want, to go into the EU, it's just blatant. It's the same.
Pardon
The
me.
people in Scotland don't want independence. The people in Scotland don't want this, don't want that. How dare they speak on behalf of the people in Scotland? And if there's any unionists watching this programme at the moment who are all screaming at the screen, or the SNP tell people what Scotland wants. Well, yeah, just look at the SNP representatives who are elected in election after election. They're entitled because they stand on SNP stands on manifestos and get elected over and over again. But for a Tory to stand there and tell us what Scotland wants, when Scotland has, for a long, long time said to the Tories, you know what, you're no welcome here, beat it. That's the bottom line. How dare they? And it is another mark of how corrupt Westminster politics has become. They lie. Boris Johnson made it an art form. He lied over and over and over again. And it has become the norm for the Tory party. Now, I almost understand that because they're like that, right? What I don't understand is Labour. I am just aghast at Keir Starmer. When I remember, this is anecdotal, I remember sitting in London with my sister-in-law when Keir Starmer was on his feet, when Jeremy Corbyn was all over the place on Brexit, and Keir Starmer was on his feet making an impassioned plea for Remain. And my sister-in-law said, do you know what, if he was leader of the Labour Party, people would vote for him. And what's he done? He's turned his back on all these people that found him a sensible voice that they could relate to, in right across England. He has turned his back on it. And even when you look at some of the studies that have been done in England, never mind Scotland and the rest of the EU that we've just talked about, there are more and more people saying that that is the full impact of Brexit and that, they may well have voted differently had they. And when we're talking about lies, there was no more blatant lying than we had in the Brexit Leave campaign. That was truly blatant. And what Keir Starmer's now doing is saying that was okay. You know, I actually am now saying we should just stick with that, even though they lied all the way through. And that doesn't bode well for UK democracy either. Everything that's happening in the UK at the moment is infringing on democracy. And that's a very, very sad state of affairs. As far as the rest of Europe's concerned, and the other European countries saying, where there is less of an appetite for leaving the EU than there had been previously, I think there's two reasons for that. I don't think you can discount the effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on that. People are thinking solidarity is a good thing and sticking together. And when you look back to the very basis of Common Market EU, all our international institutions, they were based on a solidarity that said, look, let's not have any more strife and wars as far. So I think that's an issue. But I think the UK has become the laughingstock of the rest of the EU, and the other countries are looking at it and saying, oh my goodness, what a disaster. We're in the best place. So I think there's two reasons there for that finding.
It is something which causes me. I'm deeply concerned as a journalist who spends all the time looking at this, at the prospect of the sunsetting clauses, at the prospect of all at the end of 2023, any EU law on the books, even if it doesn't have a replacement, will just get swept away. And in fact, the UK government can just sort of throw things in there without it having to go through Westminster. I mean, it seems to me a fairly unprecedented assault on democracy,
Yeah.
and I'm very shocked that the lawyer of Keir Starmer's status would be so blasé about continuing Brexit, and so I don't understand. I don't understand how the from human rights abuses to the economy, um, how that can be uh, sanctioned. But I'm hang on. So I mean, so here we go to the story. The story here with the UK could soon be placed on the list of countries that abuse rather than protect human rights with its outright assault on the rights of its own citizens and aggressive rollback of protections on the right to assemble and protest, according to the international non-governmental organisation Human Rights. The acting executive director, Tarana Hassan, says the shrinking civic space is now relegated to countries far away. Human Rights Watch warned of seeing a very worrying trend with a slew of legislation passed last year where fundamental human rights are being challenged. They expressed particular concern over the protest law. So, I mean, here we've got the Public Order Bill, which would restrict the right to protest and increase penalties. The Elections Act, requiring voter identification at UK-wide elections. The law limiting people's rights to judicially review social security and immigration decisions. The Nationality and Borders Act, which criminalises asylum seekers, even though asylum seekers have no legitimate routes that they can take, because you can only make an application for asylum once you're in the country, and there are no routes in. Even for Afghans, that's now hard. And increasing powers to strip people of citizenship and allowing offshore processing of asylum claims. And that's before you even get into the whole issue of removing the right to strike and
Mm.
a whole range. I mean, it seems as though we're on a precipice uh, of the sort of the decency which many people took for granted within these shores. I mean, how alarmed should we be?
I think we should be very alarmed. I mean, Human Rights Watch is an organisation that has great credibility and has been doing really good work for decades. And it's one of these organisations that people in power listen to. It's an organisation that's always been at the front line of correcting human rights abuses. And for them to come out and say that I think they said that there's a very small window within which the UK could roll back some of the stuff they're doing in relation to the abuse of human rights. I, I'm just absolutely appalled that this country that still talks about itself. When I say country, I'm talking about the UK at the moment. This political construct that calls itself a country, which always holds itself up as a bastion of human rights, ethics, decency, and everything else. It is not. It is no longer such. And it is going down that slippery slope of getting worse and worse and worse. And when I see some of these folk, like you had that Priti Patel and that Suella Braverman that's taken over from her, standing up there, and some of the appalling things they say, and some of the laws they want to bring in. You look at Rees-Mogg, and you're talking about the exit bill and everything else. The erosion of human rights in this country is happening, has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen. And it's, again, I say over and over again, one of the reasons I really want independence for Scotland is because I think we truly can show the rest of the, the island that is the British Isles, the UK, that another way is possible, and encourage folk in England and Wales and the north of Ireland to see that a different way is possible. Now, most English people are decent, but they are being led by awful people who are taking away all their rights. And back to that earlier discussion we had, Ruth, it suits those in power currently to disillusion people and to have them think they can do nothing about it. Suits them if people don't vote. That's part of this voter ID thing that's coming in as well. A lot of people will be disenfranchised by that. That is an abuse of human rights. But unfortunately, we also have an element of the press and media that is very right wing and that supports what the current government is doing in the UK, and which puts it out there as quite right and puts a slant on it that makes people think that things are actually okay. That's how we ended up with Brexit, because we had a right-wing press and very right-wing politicians who more or less worked together and ended up with the disaster that is Brexit. And without the protections of the EU in so many ways, it's just going to get much worse and it's going to happen much more quickly. Now, I would like to see Keir Starmer and the others really, at UK level, standing up against this the way that the SNP is standing up against it in Scotland. I'm not seeing much evidence of that, I'm afraid. And as for the Labour Party in Scotland, they're too busy having a go at the SNP in government to really fight against the Tories. It's about time they recognised who the real enemy is, for everything that the Labour Party still say they stand for. But I'm not seeing much evidence of.
Well, in terms of the way in which some people end up dealing with despair and crisis in their lives, the Drug Deaths Task Force report has come out. More than 80 actions supported by £68 million over the course of this Parliament are outlined in the Scottish Government's response to changing lives, the final report from the Drug Deaths Task Force. Measures are being taken across a broad range of areas, including employment, justice, transport, education, health and social care, to improve the lives of those affected by drugs. The response is underpinned by two principles: that services treat problem drug use the same as any other health condition, and that people with lived experience are involved in policy decisions. Many of the 20 recommendations and 139 action points made by the task force are already being addressed, but new announcements include £30 million ring-fenced from the enhanced services allocation to NHS territorial boards from April 2023 to support specific drug treatment services within primary care settings, £18 million to develop stabilisation and crisis care services, in addition to the £100 million already available for residential rehabilitation, £4.3 million for a stigma action plan, which includes an accreditation scheme for organisations to improve awareness and challenge stigma across public life, £5.5 million for new programmes for children and families, including the expansion of Roots, a young person support group run by Scottish families affected by drugs, £3.4 million additional funding to deliver a workforce action plan and expand the addiction workers training programme run by the Scottish Drugs Forum, and an additional £3.3 million to expand trauma training, £2.4 million to improve care for people with co-occurring mental health and substance use conditions to build on the recommendations set out in the recent rapid review, and £500,000 for an initial pilot to expand the concessionary travel scheme to include people with a substance dependency. Drugs Policy Minister Angela Constant said, "Every drug death is a tragedy and is unacceptable. We continue to face a public health emergency and cannot underestimate the scale of this crisis." This publication outlines our whole government commitment to addressing this challenge and ensuring that people with problem substance use can access all the services they need and are entitled to. In Scotland's drug deaths and drug addiction, substance use problem is pretty legendary, unfortunately, across the EU, and yet the levers that we could be using often seem, to be restricted from us. For example, the safe consumption rooms.
Yeah.
Some programs where people can get the drugs that they are using tested to make sure they're safe. Social work is being cut appallingly, so that the potential for stopping people before they fall through those cracks is being removed. I guess we do have the step forward of naloxone being made available, but there's there's a huge amount that needs to be done. How likely do you think this funding is and this program is to be addressing some of those key issues?
Oh my. There's a big question. I think these things all sound very good, but they've got to be done as a holistic way of looking at things. And, and I mean, I saw Gillian Mackay from the Greens today talking about that very thing, that you can't just say that deals with that, that deals with that, deals with that. You have to look at the bigger picture, and you have to look at the longer term, because you don't fix that and then walk away. You have to over years, because people can revert back. So bigger picture is the main thing that has to be done.
Or anything to make people's lives a bit better and to try and stop some of the human misery that's
Yeah.
going on. Speaking of people living in miserable conditions, nearly 100 British council contractors forced to live in hiding since. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having somebody in my ear. The winter funding, is it? So, the voice in my ear is asking me to go to the winter funding story, an important issue. Social Justice Secretary Shona Robeson has announced an additional £2.4 million in funding to help people struggling to afford food and other essentials. The funds will go to 4 organisations to distribute mainly on a cash-first basis to people in immediate need in the face of the cost of living crisis. That's £1 million to the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, 1 million 50 over £1 million to the Cora Foundation for their Household Hardship Fund, £100,000 to Citizens Advice Scotland to expand their shopping card pilot, £250,000 to Fair Share to supplement the supply from surplus and donations. A focus on crisis payments and shopping cards will allow people to choose for themselves what they need. Ms Robeson announced the funding on a visit to Prospect Community Housing in Wester Hailes, Edinburgh, where she heard how staff are helping residents through debt and income advice services. She said, "I know people are struggling with the cost of food and other essentials right now, and this additional funding will get more support to some of those who need it most this winter. We are working with partners to prioritise urgent cash-first action when it comes to food insecurity, and this will take some of the pressure off food banks." But Linda, this comes right back to what you were saying about having to rely on donations, voluntary organisations. I mean,
Absolutely. And
when did we
the
become a
Scottish
nation that
Government
thought food
having
banks were okay?
Yeah, I mean, the Scottish Government having to mitigate again, and you get the opposition standing up all the time and saying, spend on this, spend on that, spend on the next thing. Yeah, the money is limited, unfortunately, because of our situation, and we have to mitigate. There is an absolute will by the Scottish Government, and indeed, I would say by most in the Scottish Parliament, that people should not be hungry. That's why funding's going to Fair Share, additionally to the funding that goes to many other things. People should have a roof over their heads. So therefore, money going to the Scottish Federation and Corran, and people are entitled to good advice. Money going to citizens' advice, but it's all to deal with things that are happening because of the Westminster government's policies. So, again, we could do it so much better if we took our own decisions. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And,
Well,
you know, it would just make such a difference. Such a difference.
Well, on a note of a call for action and a cry for change, that's all we have time for
Yeah.
this evening. Before I go, I want to thank my guest, Linda Fabiani. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Linda, and for your
Pleasure.
perspectives and your experience. Um, Before I go, I would like to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. We don't get government funding. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We really couldn't do it without you. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. But, and here's a bit that you can do even if you don't have cash in your pocket, we have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. And if you can't afford to put your hand in your pocket because times are tough, please watch our programmes, share them, talk to folk that perhaps do have the extra £5, spread the word, get more people watching Broadcasting Scotland, because we will give you the news that you're not going to see elsewhere. Good night, and thank you for watching.